Dumbledore's white guilt confession. It all started during what was supposed to be a routine Monday morning assembly. Dumbledore had called the entire school together to discuss important matters of community dialogue, which everyone knew meant another one of his rambling, indecisive speeches where he'd ask for student input on whether they should change the colour of the toilet paper in the bathrooms. Harry sat with Ron and Hermione at the Gryffindor table, watching as Dumbledore approached the podium with his usual collection of notes, scrolls, and what appeared to be a self-help book titled Decolonizing Your Mind, A White Person's Guide to Not Being Problematic. Students, faculty, and IPAth non-binary members of our community, Dumbledore began, his voice already shaking slightly. I have called you here today because I have been doing some very important self-reflection, and I realize that that is to say, primarily I. He stopped, took off his half-moon spectacles, and wiped them nervously. I need to address the elephant in the room, he continued, his voice getting higher. And that elephant is my whiteness. The great hall went completely silent. Even the ghost stopped floating around to stare. For too long, Dumbledore said, gripping the podium, I have used my position of privilege, my white, male, cisgender, heterosexual privilege, to make decisions for this school without properly centering marginalized voices. And I am so very sorry. Professor McGonagall looked like she wanted to crawl under the head table. Professor Snape, who had been lounging in his chair, suddenly sat up straight. Oh, hell no, Snape muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. This old fool about to have a whole breakdown over being white. Professor Snape, Dumbledore said, turning toward him with tears actually forming in his eyes, your comment perfectly illustrates the problem. As a black educator, you shouldn't have to witness my white fragility on display like this. I'm centering my own guilt instead of listening to your lived experience. My lived experience right now is watching you lose your damn mind, Snape replied. And I ain't signed up for this therapy session. Dumbledore nodded vigorously. Yes, exactly. You see how I immediately made it about my feelings instead of acknowledging the harm I've caused? This is textbook white supremacy behavior? In the audience, Draco Malfoy raised his hand. Professor, aren't you being a bit dramatic? You're not exactly running a plantation here. Draco. Hermione gasped. That's incredibly insensitive. No, Dumbledore said, waving his hands frantically. Mr. Malfoy raises an important point, even if it's problematically phrased. You see, I may not be running a plantation, but I am perpetuating systems of oppression through my very existence in this position of power. He pulled out what appeared to be a prepared list and unrolled it dramatically. I have made a comprehensive inventory of my privileges and the harm I have caused, he announced. First, I am white in a position of authority, which automatically makes me complicit in white supremacy. But sir, piped up a confused first year, isn't everyone supposed to be equal? There. Dumbledore pointed at the child triumphantly. That's colorblind racism. The belief that we're all equal ignores the very real differences in our lived experiences and the structural advantages I possess. Professor Flitwick, who was roughly 3 feet tall, looked around in bewilderment. Albus, what exactly are you trying to accomplish here? I'm trying to use my privilege to amplify marginalized voices, Phileas. But I realize now that even doing that centers my own white savior complex. So what the hell do you want us to do about it? Snape called out, clearly fed up. You want us to pat you on the head and tell you it's okay to be white? Now. Dumbledore cried out, actually starting to hyperventilate. That would be asking for emotional labor from people of color. I need to do the work myself. But what? Harry called out, genuinely confused. Dumbledore turned to face the students, his beard quivering with emotion. The work of dismantling my internalized white supremacy. I have been researching, and I discovered that everything I've ever done has been problematic. He began pacing back and forth, his robes billowing dramatically. The house system? Segregation. The points system? Capitalist competition. My position as headmaster? Hierarchical oppression. Even my beard, this long, White beard is a symbol of patriarchal authority. Your beard is a symbol of patriarchal authority. McGonagall asked weakly. Yes. Haven't you read A Facial Hair and the Masculine Gaze, How Beards Perpetuate Gender Binaries? It's very enlightening. Ramad leaned over to Harry. Is he having some sort of mental breakdown? I think so, Harry whispered back. Should we do something? What are we supposed to do? This is way above our pay grade. Meanwhile, Dumbledore had moved on to item number 2 on his list. Second, he continued, I have consistently failed to acknowledge that my magical ability is a form of privilege that oppresses non-magical peoples. That's literally what being a wizard means, said a Ravenclaw 6th year. Exactly. We are all complicit in a system that marginalizes muggles. We should be using our magic to serve them, not to separate ourselves in hidden communities. Serve them. Draco repeated. Like slaves. No, not like slaves. Like allies. Magical allies working to dismantle the wizard-muggle hierarchy. Professor Snape had heard enough. He stood up from his chair and walked toward the podium. All right, old man, that's enough, he said, reaching for Dumbledore's arm. You need to sit your craziest down before these kids think you completely lost it. But Severus, Dumbledore protested, I haven't finished acknowledging my complicity in the oppression of house elves, centaurs, goblins, and other magical creatures who... I don't give a damn about your guilt trip, Snape interrupted. These kids got classes to go to, and you up here having a whole identity crisis like you just discovered racism was invented yesterday. I'm trying to be accountable. You trying to be crazy. Sit down. But Dumbledore wasn't finished. He pulled away from Snape and turned back to the microphone. Third item on my accountability list, he announced breathlessly, I have failed to examine how my heteronormative assumptions have created an unsafe environment for LGBTQ+ students. We have LGBTQ+ students, asked a confused Hufflepuff. Everyone is potentially LGBTQ+ until they explicitly state otherwise. Dumbledore declared. Assuming heterosexuality is a form of violence. Assuming heterosexuality is violence. McGonagall repeated faintly. Yes. And I've been doing it for decades. Every time I've assumed a student was straight without asking their sexual orientation, I've been perpetuating heteronormative oppression. Hermione, who had been frantically taking notes this entire time, suddenly stood up. Professor Dumbledore, while I appreciate your commitment to social justice, don't you think you might be overcorrecting a bit? The entire hall turned to stare at her. Hermione advocating for moderation was like seeing a unicorn tap dance. Miss Granger, Dumbledore said, his eyes wild with the fervour of the newly woke, there is no such thing as overcorrecting when it comes to dismantling systems of oppression. Every day that I don't actively challenge my privilege is another day I'm complicit in harm. But sir, Harry called out, if you are so worried about your privilege, why don't you just quit? The question hung in the air like a particularly awkward silence charm. Dumbledore blinked several times, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Well, you see. I can't quit because then I wouldn't be able to use my privilege to help marginalized communities, but if I stay, I'm perpetuating the very systems I'm trying to dismantle, but if I leave, that's just white flight, which is also problematic. He stood there for a moment, trapped in his own circular logic, before his eyes rolled back and he fainted dead away, crashing to the floor behind the podium. Professor McGonagall rushed forward while Professor Snape just shook his head. Told you all this fool was crazy, Snape announced to the hall. Man done thought himself into a coma worrying about being white. As McGonagall revived Dumbledore with a splash of water, he sat up groggily and looked around at the concerned faces surrounding him. Did I finish my accountability statement? He asked weakly. You got about halfway through before you passed out from white guilt, Snape replied. Which, I gotta say, is probably a first in the history of education. Dumbledore struggled to his feet, still looking dazed. But I haven't addressed my complicity in the gender binary, or my failure to acknowledge indigenous magical practices, or my participation in the able-bodied supremacy of requiring students to physically attend classes. Albus McGonagall said firmly, I think that's quite enough consciousness-raising for one day. Perhaps you should rest. But the work is never finished. Dumbledore protested. I need to schedule individual apology meetings with every marginalized student, faculty member, and house elf in the castle. What you need, said Snape, is some damn perspective. And maybe a hobby that don't involve crying about being white. As they helped Dumbledore off the stage, he continued muttering about his privilege and the need for reparations. The students slowly filed out of the Great Hall, most of them looking thoroughly confused. Well, said Rumard as they walked to their first class, that was something. I kind of feel bad for him, Harry admitted. I mean, he's trying to do the right thing. He's trying to do something, Hermione corrected. I'm just not sure what. Behind them, they could hear Dumbledore's voice echoing down the corridor, I should resign. No, wait, that's white flight. I should stay and do better. No, that's centering my white feelings. Maybe I should. Somebody needs to hide his social justice books, Snape's voice boomed in response. Before he guilt himself to death. And with that, Hogwarts officially became the first magical school in history where the headmaster had a nervous breakdown over his own race. The worst part? It was only Monday.